Welcome back for the review of a game console known as the Sega Master System. As I was starting to talk about last time, this would be released about 2 years prior to the classic, of course, Sega Genesis. So, like the original Nintendo, this was released as a 8-bit console. Now, one thing about this, of course, you have your power button right there, if you can see it. I'll have to polish this up in some. Of course, here's your classic vents to keep it from overheating, obviously. Your classic 4, putting the games in. You have your reset button here. Strangely enough, your pause button is on the actual console rather than on a controller. And this is called card import. There was some special games attachment you would plug in, and you would slip a little card in this little tiny slot here. Sort of a little bit smaller than the games for like the TurboGrafx 16. But nevertheless, it's a true classic find. If you consider yourself a true fan and collector of the and 16-bit war era, definitely the Sega Master System is a very good console to collect for. Though some of the games are starting to skyrocket in price, unfortunately. There are games that you can get for good prices. Now, one thing about the controller is overall design reminds me very similar of the original the original Nintendo, of course, with button 1, which also is your start button as well, and button 2. I will say the D-pad is a little weird in design compared to some of your other, say your original Nintendo D-pad. I think is probably better made overall. But given the design of this, is probably designed a little more for obviously like on-rail shooters or jet flying games, such as I mentioned, games like Afterburner, which of course you have an Afterburner 2 on the Sega Genesis. Also games like Thunderblade, though you play with a helicopter instead of an F-15 fighter jet. And this version is probably closer to the arcade port than the Afterburner game. But given we're talking an 8-bit console here, these are actually pretty good overall quality-wise for the time period. And also, this would get, of course, a port of the original Double Dragon, which if you did not grow up in the and 16-bit era, you would know that in the late 80s throughout like to the mid 90s, beat 'em ups were some of the biggest, most successful games in the arcade, in general everywhere, obviously, which most people remember Super Nintendo for games such as Final Fight from Capcom, which of course some of the characters from that series would go on to be introduced in different Street Fighter games, like Street Fighter Alpha as well as Street Fighter 3 series. Anyways, and yeah, this is definitely one of the original beat-em-ups you had from back in the day. Double Dragon is a true classic series. And let's just forget about that movie. But yeah, now this game right here, it shows it was ported in 1988. So, yeah. Surprisingly, I was actually surprised at finding such a good deal on this. Given its rarity, they're not easy to come by, mainly because in Japan and the United States, the Sega Master System was actually a big flop, surprisingly. However, it would gain a huge following in Brazil in general and a lot of South America, but predominantly Brazil. It would sell very well there, and it would become a humongous success in Europe, believe it or not. Specifically countries like England, France and Germany is where it would make the huge number, especially England. Retro gaming stores in England have in their stores, basically finding Sega Master System games in Europe are like Super Nintendo and NES games in America, if you want to do a good comparison. And I hope you like this music in the background from, of course, the awesome game The Darkness. Now, I thought I'd quickly also talk a little bit about this game, which I've known a little bit about from researching on retro and also Sega history. This is actually one of the very first action role-playing games ever released, not just on console, but this is one of actually the first 3 action role-playing games to be released on Sega hardware, on the Sega Master System. This game, of course, Miracle Warriors, Seal of the Dark Lord, as well as the original Phantasy Star game, which, on average, that game is going to be a little bit harder to get a hold of nowadays. On average, it's trending for anywhere from $60 up to $100, so good luck with that one. Now, this game you can actually get for probably about $20 or so. So it's a pretty reasonable price given it's not a super easy to come by game unless you go to a lot of retro game conventions and places. That's one thing with Sega Master System and consoles like this, you definitely have to know your background research and history on Sega if you're going to collect for it, because you need to know what type of games to look for. Oh yeah, and one awesome feature about the Master System, I don't know of really any other consoles that have this feature. If you don't put any games into this console when you turn it on, believe it or not, it actually has a built-in video game built into the actual console. So even if you don't actually have a game yet or something, you can just turn on the console without putting a cartridge in, and it will actually play a game. Now, if I'm remember correctly, this particular model that I picked up has some type of maze game in it. I forget the exact name of it, but yeah. Which is actually, I'm kind of curious to try, since this is my first ever chance to actually truly enjoy Sega Master System. As a humongous Sega collector and a Sega fanboy, this is actually a dream come true to finally get a Sega Master System. Now, if you want, you can get a special adapter device for the Genesis that will allow you to play. Now, I'll quickly show you actually what these... It's interesting how most games all have the same background and stuff, though, with different artwork. Personally, this is probably some of my favorite artwork of cartridges and stuff I've seen. Now, the booklet itself, nothing special, as you see. It looks more like earlier PC stuff you would see from, like, early Mac and stuff like that from the 80s. Booklet here, and then you have a very plain looking cartridge, as we see. Nothing really special about it, just its name, and all cartridges are the exact same, as you can see here, just with its name. It wouldn't be really until more, I would say that's one thing I give to Nintendo. They did a better job on the overall cartridge design and stuff, artwork, where this is just a very plain thing. So yeah, now what you would do, of course, just like any other cartridge-based console, you would just put it right in like this. Now you have to put a little more force in, unfortunately, but yeah, it's just that simple. And then enjoy playing classic games. Now, total and its lifespan in America, it would end up selling not even 2 million copies in all of North America. Less than 2 million. Which is why it's a little harder to find here in the US. Now, over in Japan, it sold only about 300,000 or 400,000. So between Japan and North America, it only sold probably around between 2 to 2.5 million units total. It, however, sold in its entire lifetime between 13 and 14 million units worldwide. It would end up selling between around 4 million or so units would sell in Brazil alone. It would also sell an estimate around 5 to 5.5 million units in Europe, which is why it's so much easier to find them overseas in Europe, because in Europe it sold probably about 3 or 4 times as many units, which is why it has a much larger library. Now, domestically in the United States, it would end up seeing only about 130 games or so its total lifespan. However, if you add the collection of also Brazil and Europe together, the actual library of the Master System would probably be more around the range of around probably close to 300 games or so. So it would over double the library when you add Europe and Brazil. But that's just a little bit of discussion about what I feel is probably one of the most overlooked games. Easily one of the most overlooked Sega games in history. But this would be the console that would lead to the beginning of course, later on, its successor, the Sega Genesis. Now, total market share, quickly I'll say before I cut up this video. This console only held about 12% of the total game market, while Nintendo would continue to dominate around 85% of the entire market until the 16-bit war era. But in the 8-bit era, unfortunately, Sega did not succeed, even though it actually released a lot of really good games and a pretty solid overall 8-bit console. So, anyways, this is Goku7DBZ, getting ready to cut up this review. Hope you enjoyed it, found any of this information interesting. If you would like to know anything else, better in-depth information on the Sega Master System and its history, I recommend you check out, actually, a video from an awesome duo here on YouTube called GameSack, and check out their video on Sega Master System. They have much greater knowledge on the games and everything than I do. I have much more limited knowledge on things, but I actually bothered to learn and research what I do know, rather than read Wikipedia. But anyways, I'll get ready to cut this up, and stay tuned for an upcoming comic book review, which I will be reviewing issue number 2 of the rebooted Robotech comics. I'll see you then. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel.